Hello, I'm here with Massimo Cingolani, who is the managerial advisor for the European Investment Bank. Massimo, thanks for joining me today. I want to start, first of all, by getting your assessment of where we are in as far as the euro. Is it a crisis or a recovery? What's your own feeling about the situation today?
Thank you for inviting me to answer to this question. Let me just clarify that I speak on a personal basis. I do not represent officially the views of the European Investment Bank. My own assessment is that the economy is marginally better than a few months ago, but I personally think that there are some structural problems to be solved in the medium-long term, which have not been addressed yet. So therefore the recovery is a temporary improvement which can last some time, but it is not a solution, if you want, to the major problems that have been discussed in this very interesting conference.
What do you think are the main structural problems that have yet to been addressed in the Eurozone?
Well, I mean, there are several problems and they have been discussed in this conference, which title is full employment within or without the euro. I'm personally convinced that it is possible to follow full employment policy within the euro, but most of the experts who spoke in this conference probably think the contrary. This is not the only question, but I would say is probably the main question. Because in order for the citizen to be convinced that Europe is delivering, Europe must achieve a situation where they feel comfortable to realize their expectations, as Alain Parguez has developed in his various writings. Therefore, they should have the possibility to plan their life, to plan family, to plan a job. And in order to provide for that, you need to make full employment policies. And that is not yet done.
And that seems to me, I mean, for all the talk about what the European Central Bank has done or will do, that seems to be more the province of fiscal policy. And there it seems to be more of a political problem rather than an institutional problem.
Certainly there is a question of politicians to decide to engage in the direction of a full employment policy. And there is also an institutional question because in my view, my personal view, in the roads towards European integration, the instruments of macroeconomic policy should be transferred at the federal level, at the European level. And one of these instruments has been transferred at the European level, which is monetary policy.
But not fiscal policy.
But not fiscal policy. So the question is that at this stage of the integration process, there is not a policy consensus in Europe to move the fiscal instruments at European level. And that is why in the paper that we presented together with Nadia Garbellini and Ariel Wirkeman, we have made some simulation indicating that maybe it would be possible in the absence of, let's say, a federal budget, EU budget of a larger scope, to simulate, if you want, a federal deficit of the European Union. So, in fact, without going in one step to reach the point where you would have a budgetary policy of the European Union, you could achieve the same result by voluntary cooperation of fiscal policy.
The voluntary cooperation has not been evident so far, and I would think that in the proposal in which you envisage, you would presumably, the idea would be that you would have certain countries that now have smaller fiscal deficits, such as Germany, running larger fiscal deficits in order to achieve that sort of broadly based simulation. I mean, presumably you'd want it to be evenly spread in terms of the Germans, I would think, would be concerned about the so-called free rider problem, that you just allow a license for the periphery countries, for example, to spend if it's not done with some sort of external control.
Well, I would like to clarify that in our proposal, it is not, if you want, automatic that countries which have a surplus today would spend more than the others, or would not gain more than the others in a process of voluntary cooperation, because in fact, and I think this is also in part the responsibility of the experts who have to make simulations to show that these results are possible, to show that in fact if you define an increase, for example, in public expenditure in a certain way, which is on the certain criteria optimal, to achieve a certain growth target.
To achieve a so-called higher multiplier effect, as we economists like to say.
Yes, you could reach a higher multiplier effect, but this is so you should concentrate spending on those countries which have more spillover effects on the others. So you should take into account of spillover and feedback effects through trade, and this is, let's say, what you can call the Arad foreign trade multiplier. And in that way, you could calculate sort of optimal way to share expenditure and costs of this policy. And in fact, calculations show that, for example, strangely enough, Germany would gain more by a coordinated effort than other countries. So if Germany wanted to achieve the same result, it would cost more to Germany to do that. So in fact, when you take into account of trade flows, and we cannot pretend that our analysis, of course, is an answer to everything, but it's just a first step, first analysis, in the direction of showing that if you calculate well your multiplier effects through intra-trade, then you could achieve much more effective results.
Now this is intra-European trade as opposed to intercontinental trade. This is what you're talking about?
Well, in fact, in Europe, most trade is intra-trade. It is true that you also have trade outside the European Union.
Especially with Germany, because Germany does have quite a large, large amount of trade outside the European Union.
This morning, I think an Argentinian economist who was present in the conference quoted the figure of 60% of German trade going to Europe. I don't know if this figure is correct, but it gives you an indication.
It's still a very significant part of it.
It is an important part, and it is normal, because normally you trade with the countries with whom you are a neighbor. It is logical. So all European countries trade with each other. Even UK, if you want, if you calculate well, UK trades more with the European Union than with the rest of the world.
Which is something that people ought to remind them of when they have this debate about whether they should pull out of the European Union or not. Now, I've read the paper. You've used existing data, but presumably, given the models, you could have used simulations. So, for example, if you wanted to calculate how much of a fiscal stimulus would be necessary in order to require or achieve full employment, you could presumably do that with your with the models that you've been working with.
Yes, I mean, as I said, this is a first step, and the calculation is only made in terms of increased GDP. We have not attempted to calculate the effect on employment, but this would be, if you want, to a certain extent mechanical, but it would require more work, more resources, because this is a work that we have done ourselves in our spare time, so we could not really make a gigantic research on that.
But if you had to make a judgment, how much of a fiscal deficit as a percentage of overall Eurozone GDP do you think you would require right now, if you to put a rough estimate on it in order to achieve something closer to full employment? By full employment, let's define it as something closer to 3 or 4%. Some people would go lower, but let's just take that as a number.
I cannot give you a precise answer to this question.
No,
What I can quote is a figure which was in a report made in the 70s or in the 80s, the McDougall report, which was which was saying that the European budget should aim at some 20% of GDP. But however, since this was politically unfeasible, in the first step of the European Union, the EU budget should be 5% of GDP. Now it's today 1%, which is a fifth of that. So, and on top of that, it's not a deficit.
That's the total Eurozone deficit as a percentage of the overall GDP is about 1. I thought it was around 2.5%. It's only 1% right now.
I'm talking now about the budget of the European Union.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
As a percentage of GDP. The current account deficit, I have not made the calculation. So, I have heard some calculations that probably. Some estimates that full employment would imply a current account deficit of the order of 2 to 3% of GDP, but I would not associate myself with this calculation. I just quote it.
There, again, one of the things that's attractive about your paper is that you reflect the institutional realities, which is to say that when people talk about the need for a supranational treasury, one of the difficulties, of course, is that you'd need changes to the Maastricht Treaty. And in the current environment, that might be very, very difficult to achieve. Now, you work for the European Investment Bank. I realize that these are your own personal views, but that is already enshrined in the Maastricht Treaty. And I think it's also the case that the European Investment Bank is allowed to leverage its equity to the tune of 10 to 1, actually. And so it would seem to me, I might be mistaken about this, but it would seem to me to be a good vehicle to use, for example, funding infrastructure projects, which would have a very significant multiplier effect and help to achieve this full employment status that you're looking for.
Well, certainly. And I speak for myself, certainly the European Investment Bank is increasingly used in an anti-cyclical manner. The European Investment Bank was asked to increase its annual lending to Europe by 20 billion per year, with the idea of, because as you know, we finance only 50% of the investment cost. So in fact this already would be doubled, and then you should calculate the fact that this would trigger other investments. So you have a multiplier effect which is, I think if I remember correctly, of the order of 400 billion total from 60 billion that you start with for 3 years. And so the bank is used for that purpose. I imagine that it could be used more, but I think a certain number of questions should be analyzed, and I think it should be addressed by the competent people, not by me.
I think you're being modest, but on that note of modesty, we shall leave it. Massimo Cingolani, thank you very much for joining me today. Thank you.